To say that retro video games are pretty neat would be the understatement of the minute, and judging by how popular they are in the modern day, it would appear that I'm not the only one that thinks this. However, despite all the classic consoles, compilations, and digital game stores, there's still plenty of great licensed games based on movies and TV shows that still haven't been officially re-released due to legal bullshit. And you know what? My buddy Lonnie and I think that's a real shame, because rather than making some money without even doing an ass hair of work, rights holders would rather force people to track down and buy physicals of these games, or just download them illegally so nobody makes any money. But oddly enough though, Disney of all people realized how ridiculous this is and decided to let Capcom release a compilation of their best NES games while also porting the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis versions of Lion King onto modern consoles. And on top of making physical copies of these games for modern consoles, they even made limited reprints for the original consoles they appeared on to take things an ass hair further. Some people probably think that's pretty weird, and I can't really argue that point, but I still think it's better than giving modern devs 20 minutes to rush something out in time for their theatrical counterparts. But as cool as it is to see Disney giving games based off their IPs a second chance at life though, there's still assloads more licensed games out there that rights holders need to give the same treatment to. So sit back in my buddy Lonnie's lawn chair that he stole from some guy named Eddie, tell your father to diversify his portfolio, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, the world's least intimidating full-grown boy, Cameron all one word, to tell you the 11 licensed retro games that need modern re-releases the most. But before I do, just know that I'm trying to stick to one game per franchise unless there's multiple games in the same franchise that were all made by the same developer or something like that. Because that way, a lot of these games could be a part of a compilation or something like that, which would definitely be preferable given that a lot of these games are like half a kilobyte. Now that we've got all that malarkey out of the way though, let's begin with number 11, WWF No Mercy. This one's probably highly unlikely since 2K currently owns the WWE license, and even beyond that, I'm sure WWE themselves wouldn't like the idea of a game being sold promoting a roster that isn't even around anymore. Well, at least for the most part anyway. So if anything, No Mercy's only hope at seeing the light of day again would probably be through some kind of remake with the current roster, with most of the old wrestlers being absent, whether it be because they're in another company, or because, well, let's just say they've done some less than honorable things over the years. Even though I haven't played a wrestling game since 2005, I'm sure the 2K series is all well and good aside from the botchfest that was 2K20, and probably even better than No Mercy if you don't take nostalgia into consideration, but even so, something about the AKI engine just feels so unique to where it'll always have a place in this world. Whether or not an HD remake for this game's even possible though, it's good to know that Kenny Omega's determined to ensure that the upcoming AEW game gets a hold of this engine. All I know is that one way or another, my mustard-stained ass is playing as Chris Jericho. Number 10, Toy Story. There have been assloads of Toy Story games over the years, and the more of them that you could fit into a compilation, the better, but if we're gonna narrow it down to one game, then I'm going with the 1995 release on the Super Nintendo. There was also a Genesis version of the same exact game that was an ass hair better in certain areas by adding music to cutscenes and stuff like that, but overall, the Super Nintendo had much better colors and sound. It's not exactly a 2D platformer that lit the world on fire or anything like that, but it's still one that I had a lot of fun with, as an adult. And now that the Toy Story franchise seems to be done forever, the time frame of giving this game another chance to shine is only going to keep getting smaller and smaller, so if you ask me, it's now or never. Number 9, Tiny Toons Buster's Hidden Treasure. Not only is the Tiny Toons cartoon one of the most overlooked and underrated ever, but the same could be said for the games it produced back in the 90s. I mean, yeah, a few people these days actually acknowledge how good it is, but beyond that, nobody really talks about it. And much like those talks with your parents about how your father was born, these are the types of conversations we ought to be having. If it were up to me, and God knows it should be, I'd make a compilation of all the Konami-made Tiny Toons games, and I'd even go an ass hair further and toss Animaniacs in for good measure. But if I had to pick just one Tiny Toons game to get a modern re-release, then it would definitely be Buster's Hidden Treasure on the Sega Genesis. Nothing against the Mario 3 clone on the NES or Buster Lets Loose on the Super Nintendo, which is honestly probably the better game of the two. But you know what, this is my list, and if you thought I was angry about all these games being underappreciated, then just imagine the contempt I have for the majority of mankind who don't even know about Buster's Hidden Treasure at all. First off, a lot of people think the Genesis had horrible sound, but while that is true for multiplats, games that were made from the ground up on Sega's console typically had great music, and the same could be said for Buster's Hidden Treasure, specifically the sound effects. It's a relatively straightforward platformer, but there's never any cheap bullshit that's found in a lot of other older games, and the boss battles are all great, especially if you're a fan of the show. Now, I will fully admit that I've got a bit of a nostalgia butt plug for this one, and that this entry's really for a compilation since these games were all made by Konami, and if you could put one game in a modern re-release, then you could probably do them all. But the reason I'm focusing on Buster's Hidden Treasures because quite frankly, this game deserves a lot more love, and if I could inspire even one person to Google it for like a second, then I'll feel like I've done Jesus' work. In fact, Jesus himself actually said he'd give me $1 to put this game here, so if you'll excuse me, I need to move on with this video so I can go collect my bounty at the rendezvous point. Number 8. The Adventures of Batman and Robin. I'm well aware that whether it be the Super Nintendo, Genesis, Game Gear, or even Sega CD version of this game, this one might seem a little bit random. But while I'd normally say just throw them all into a compilation and call it a day, they were all made by different people, and I'm pretty sure the Game Gear and Sega CD versions suck. The Genesis version, however, is one of the more underrated 16-bit games out there in my opinion. The platformer on the Super Nintendo is usually the one that gets all the love, and that game's great too, don't get me wrong, but they're both so hard to compare because they're so different. And honestly, as random as either of these games getting a re-release in 2020 would be even weirder to put them all into a compilation since they have the same title. So if you ask me, I'd say let the Genesis version get a second chance to shine since nobody seems to give it any attention these days, which is most likely because people don't look back on this game very fondly. I mean, the platformer on the Super Nintendo was really good, and it did have the better graphics of the two, but in my opinion, the run and gun on the Genesis was more fun, stands out a little bit more, and still looks pretty good in its own right. It's pretty much what you'd get if Batman did a fusion dance with Gunstar Heroes, and the brutal difficulty is probably why people overlook it these days. Again, I know this is another one that's kinda random, and I'm almost positive that none of these versions will ever see an official release again, but if you ever get the chance, do yourself a favor and check the Genesis version of this game out. Number 7. The Taito Flintstones games. As great as the NES was, a lot of people ignored it during its twilight years, despite the fact that that was when some of the console's best games came out. And since nobody wanted anything to do with this old hag or any of its games in this era, most of these late great titles cost more than your ass nowadays. And to make matters worse, a lot of these games were also licensed, which means that unless somebody watches my goddamn video, we're probably never gonna see any of them again through legal means. And currently, one of the most expensive games on the NES, The Flintstones at Dinosaur Peak, also happens to be a very good game. Plus, there's also the far less expensive but still pretty fun Rescue Adino and Hoppy, as well as the Game Boy and Genesis games that were all made by the same developers. And I'm not exactly sure who owns the rights to the Jetsons games, but since that was at least published by the same people and owned by Hanna-Barbera, then why not toss that into the mix too if you can? I mean, playing that game legally is pretty expensive too, you know. Even without the Jetsons though, I still think that one of the most expensive NES games getting an official re-release along with 3 other games that are pretty good is even more justifiable than Disney's compilation with Lion King and Aladdin. All I know is that I don't want to spend 30 years in a federal pound-me-in-the-ass prison just for downloading an emulator. Number 6. Bucky OHare. This game might not be nearly as pricey as the aforementioned Flintstones game, but it's still pretty pricey and definitely way more fun. I know Konami are a bunch of wieners now, but back in the day, they've definitely been known to nail it when it comes to licensed games. To be honest, I have no idea who Bucky OHare is outside of the video game, and I would do a little bit of research to inform you, but I really don't care, and I'm pretty sure you don't either. The important thing is that whether or not this show, comic, porno, educational film, educational porno, or whatever this character came from is any good, is NES game's certainly a whole heck of a mess of fun. It's basically a Mega Man clone in the sense that you choose the order of the stages you want to play, but instead of earning weapons by completing these stages, you save your teammates who all have various abilities of their own, kinda like Little Samson. The game's hard, but it's not brutal or anything like that, and even if you don't think you can take the heat, I'm pretty sure there'd be save states or a rewind feature or something like that in a re-release. And if you're still somehow not sold on this game, then go ahead and listen to the soundtrack and tell me it doesn't make you want to write a letter to your congressman about seeing this game get a re-release. I don't know who owns the rights to this game, but seeing as how obscure Bucky OHare is, I'm sure whoever that may be probably needs the money, so stop making pachinko machines for like 2 minutes and make some calls, Konami. Number 5. XMen the arcade game. Naturally, since this game's a beat-em-up, there's really not a whole lot to say about it other than the fact that, like most other games in the same genre, it's friggin' awesome. And seeing as how it was actually re-released on the PSN like 10 years ago, I'm pretty hopeful that we'll get to play it again sometime soon. Number 4. Marvel vs. Capcom Anthology. Everyone except this guy loves Smash Bros, and why wouldn't they? It's a gigantic fighting crossover where you can make some of the most unexpected characters fight each other. However, back in 1996, Capcom and Marvel had quite the fighting crossover of their own with the X-Men vs. Street Fighter that eventually evolved into the more broad Marvel vs. Capcom. I was never really good at fighting games, but when I saw this for the first time at the arcade in the Meriden Square, I metaphorically puked my pants on the spot. I mean, who would have ever thought we'd see Spider-Man vs. Mega Man, Wolverine vs. Zangief, or even Carl vs. Ricky? The last one might not have been in the game, but trust me, the fight at the arcade that day was pretty cool. And not only that, but with all the bad licensed video games up until that point, who could have imagined it would actually be so fun? Like the X-Men arcade game, it hasn't really been that long since we've seen some of these games, but a compilation similar to what Street Fighter got would be perfect. Number 3. The Simpsons Hit and Run. I really wanted to include the Simpsons arcade game instead because it's one of my personal favorite beat-em-ups ever, and actually the reason why I started skateboarding, oddly enough. But you know what, this list already has a solid beat-em-up as it is with the X-Men arcade game, and I already have the Simpsons arcade downloaded to my PS3 anyway. I mean, you can't download it anymore, and it definitely deserves a re-release, but frig it, I already have it, so I'm gonna be a dick and pick Hit and Run instead. And you know what? Given that this game's a cult classic, I don't think a lot of people would say that I'm exactly being a dick anyway. It's basically a GTA clone with The Simpsons involving the show's original writers. I mean, it's not as good as GTA or anything like that, and it actually gets a little repetitive at times, but the feeling of playing a classic Simpsons episode is more than enough to make up for its shortcomings. Number 2. The Star Wars Trilogy on the Super Nintendo. Now that Disney owns Star Wars, you'd think that the Star Wars game from the Super Nintendo would have gotten a re-release already, especially with Episode 9 coming out, but I guess EA probably wouldn't take too kindly to that, and it's a real shame too, because while these games are even harder than my dad watching Friday Night SmackDown, save states could definitely make them more accessible to casual gamers in the modern day. And you know what? Since it was made by the same developer, let's go ahead and toss Indiana Jones's Greatest Adventures into the compilation while we're at it. Number 1. Goof Troop. I have no idea what the deal with this one is, because not only is it owned by Disney, but it was also developed by Capcom. You know, the same two companies responsible for the Disney Afternoon Collection that this game wasn't a part of for some reason. In case you didn't know, Goof Troop for the Super Nintendo is essentially the precursor to what would eventually become Zelda's Four Swords games, and while it's not quite as good seeing as how it was the first, it certainly holds up well even in 2062, let alone 2020. If you're a loser like me who has no friends and a small peep, you could play it with one player and it is still pretty fun, but the game's an assload better with two people, so even if you have to hire a prostitute, mercenary, or Uber driver just to have someone to play with, you really should try to get the most out of this game if you're gonna play it. With a modern re-release that has online co-op, Goof Troop would make a welcome addition to anybody's collection. But anyway, what licensed retro games would you like to see get the Disney treatment, though? Did I miss anything important besides Turtles in Time that already has an arcade 1-up? Is there something you think I'm a turd burglar for including? Or did I absolutely nail it 100% like I always do? Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. But let me tell you, if there's two people who I'd love to see get the Disney treatment, then it would definitely be today's patrons of the day, John Polish Impossible to Say and Alec Duncan. If you want to be badasses like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes in the mail and other wacky rewards. And if you want to make a cameo, then send pictures or videos of you rocking any FU Game Crew merch like these legendary human beings you see before you. As always, like and share this video anywhere on the internet to help this channel grow. And if you want to prove that you're not down with registered sex offenders, then go ahead and press the subscribe button if you haven't already. My name's Cameron, all one word, and I'll be back with more videos soon.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.